In today's video, I'm going to be talking through my evidence for Teaching Standard 6, develop and make productive use of assessment. So my starting point for this evidence was the use of my tracker and how pupils had achieved in relation to the learning objectives. So pupils were graded on a 1 to 3 scale based on whether they'd hit my gold objective, which is a 3, silver, which is a 2, or bronze, which is a 1. Now, from the first couple of lessons that I delivered to this cohort, main thing I noticed was not only did not many of them achieve my gold objective, but also that I had to score them lower than what I felt like I ought to, just simply because I hadn't really put much in place in the way of letting the learners know what they had achieved. And this is obvious. This is evident from the colour scheme from the first 2 lessons I delivered to this group. Now, in the lesson feedback on one of these lessons, my mentor noted that I wasn't really making the learning objectives explicit and recommended that I do so at the beginning, middle, and end of lessons. And not only this, but make sure that I'd planned time to use higher and lower order questions rather than simply asking the same question of every single pupil, and to ensure I had means of checking pupils' understanding. So, for example, there was a lot of times in those couple of lessons I mentioned that because I ran out of time, that I didn't actually manage to give them an opportunity to get to the gold learning objective, which was to perform a skill in a game scenario. So making sure that I leave time for a plenary at the end to recap the learning objectives, monitor progression, and ultimately help pupils realise whether or not they had made progress. So following this conversation with my mentor, I sought to undertake some more research in terms of assessment in PE, which has previously been highlighted as a weakness of trainee PE teachers. Capel 2015 mentioned in the book Learning and Teaching Physical Education in a Secondary School that quality assessment needs to hit 3 targets. It needs to be fit for purpose, so it needs to actually be appropriate for what it says it's measuring. That the assessment needs to be made explicitly known to pupils so they know what they're being measured against, and ultimately it needs to be valid and reliable, i.e. if another teacher was to do it, would they get the same results? Now, logistics of assessment within the nature of practical PE is something that has caused me a little bit of difficulty since starting my placement, because it's difficult to make productive use of assessment where pupils are stationary for long periods of time. So this needs to be factored in terms of the planning. Now, McFadden and Bailey in 2002 and Spackman 2002 also listed 4 key attributes that they felt that assessment in PE needed or would benefit from. And these were shared learning objectives, questioning, feedback, self and peer assessment. So with this in mind, I wanted to implement this into my subsequent lesson plans, which involved ensuring that pupils were explicitly aware of the learning objectives that they were trying to hit, that my questions specifically were related to these learning objectives, and that I didn't get drawn into any coaching nuances that were perhaps not specifically relevant to my learning objectives. And finally, checking in with the class with a progress line at the start and at the end of the lesson to ensure that they knew the success criteria, they were made visually and explicitly aware of whether they had progressed or not, and they understood the context of the activities that were being presented to them in light of the learning objectives. So I felt like I'm getting better at doing this because I'm now using changing room time or the initial warm-up time in order to verify that pupils have hit my bronze objective, and that this then provides a foundation for pupils to go and hit the silver objectives. And I feel like this is starting to show in terms of pupils achieving my objectives. Equally, it's still something I'm going to have to work on, as for example, this lesson, you can see here, the behaviour was unacceptable to the point where it interfered with pupils' learning. However, I do feel like I'm starting to turn the corner, and I do feel like I'm getting better at not only planning my learning objectives, but also in making sure that my assessments that I put in place enable students to understand whether or not they have achieved these. Now, Now this file here, which